Hi, this is Dennis with Second Chance Tackle. Today we're going to be working on a Penn International 975. It's a beautiful reel. This one has really stood the test of time. Was a popular reel, then Penn discontinued it and they actually brought it back. So this one comes from Len in Delaware. Len had asked me to tune this one up. He was going to send it to the Penn factory, and unfortunately it seems like the Penn factory is backlogged and the turnaround time isn't very good, and Len wants to go fishing with his son, so he asked me if I could go ahead and do that. So I'm going to do that, and I do that start by taking off the exterior pieces. I put the pieces that I take off into a parts tray. It's just the bottom of a plastic jug, and as I do that I like to remind everybody that I want to thank our first responders and essential personnel and all of the folks involved in keeping us safe during this pandemic. That includes the fire, the police, the rescue, the EMTs, first aid squads, and all of the folks involved in the medical fields, including the hospitals and local doctors' offices. All of your efforts truly are appreciated. And as well, I'd like to thank our supply chain folks and people like the teachers and that are continuing to try and keep us about as normal as we can be while trying to keep us safe. So this is a 975. It's been squeaky. We can see that there's dried grease and dirt there, and on these little tension washers. They should not have all that browned out grease. So I suspect that this is just going to be a need for a good cleanup. And you can see that most of that stuff just wipes off easily on a paper towel. And we'll just take our time to make sure that all those pieces are cleaned before we work too far into this. There's a little bit on the back end here. I use a degreaser. I use penetrating oil to do that, and I just kind of flood the area, and then I'll go in with either a paper towel or, in this case, I'm using a cotton swab to just get that residual grease out of there. And then we can see that it remains here, and when we get to taking off the rest of this, I'll make sure that that gets cleaned off as well. All right, there's two screws that hold the side plate on, and there's two screws that hold the inner workings on. So we're going to take the side plate off first. I did pre-test this reel. It seems to be working fine. There's a little kind of a burring hum or something going on in there that grease may solve, may not. Some of those are just the characteristic of the reel. All right, those two, and then we should be able to remove the side plate, and then you can see what's going on underneath here. So we have a contained side plate here, which we'll get to in just a moment. We're going to remove the spool, and I do that because the service generally just requires that you oil the bearings, and I think there's just the one bearing here. I'm going to check underneath here. This you usually can just pull off. Well, no, this has got that speed spool set up. So this one's kind of interesting. It's adjustable, and depending on how many of these you leave on and where you leave them on is going to be the tension for the spool. And then we have a bearing back here. So I'm going to flood that. I'm using a fishing reel oil called Reel X. It's an aftermarket one. And then you have Teflon gears here. So you don't need to grease the Teflon gears at all. And you just need to make sure that they're clean. And I'm looking inside the plate here, and this is totally clean. There's nothing to be done there. Now, if you wanted to remove the side plate, if you had a broken clicker or something, you'll notice that there's a couple of small screws. There's 3 of them. And you would remove those 3 screws and pop that case off. But here you don't need to do that. And while I have this case open, I'm just going to work this line guide over to one side. And I'm going to remove the pawl so that I can service that piece. And that's usually easier to do with the spool out. That's why I'm kind of picking on that one to do that. Let's grab that carrier, and inside the carrier should be the pawl. And this is important. You want to check your pawl. Some reels will have a very big buildup of grease here. Now, I don't recommend grease on worm gears. I recommend oil. But if you use grease, make sure you get that pawl out and make sure that you run a pick or something along the edges here. Because if that dried grease accumulates there, it's going to result in a poorer performing line guide. Also, it's good to take the pawl out. You can see we've got a little bit of that dried grease that we saw on the other end there on here, so we'll do the same thing. We'll just kind of use the WD-40 or penetrating oil, and some description as the degreaser, and we're just going to kind of run that again in the paper towel just to make sure it's nice and clean, which it is. But then we can reinsert back into the carrier, which we filled with oil, and then we can reinsert that into the line guide here. Now when you reinsert those two forked tongs or tines don't always mesh with the worm gear, so just be careful, take your time. Like here it's binding, so just work it a little bit left and right, and you'll eventually move the pawl and the channel so that it aligns. And once it aligns, then you can tighten down. So right now we're still a little bit stuck. So it's just a little bit of playing around until you get it in the right channel. You'll feel it. I think we got it there. And then we'll do a little bit of a pull on that. And yep, the line guide's working fine. And then the last thing we're going to do on that line guide service is make sure that the worm gear gets its fair amount of oil as well. All right, the back end of the case is done. The spool is done. The bearing is oiled like the back bearing was. The only thing left on the spool then is just a little bit of grease onto the shaft that's going to go through the gears. All right, we're going to just load that in. Make sure that it's seated nicely. Nice clean reel. And let's go over to the business end of this reel then. We're going to take this off and we're going to just make sure that everything is clean and lubed so that Len can take this thing fishing again. Alright, there's one screw comes out. I'm going to put that in my parts tray. I like to compare side plate screws. It's an easy assumption to say that these two screws are going to be the same. It's not always the case. And just make sure as you're doing this that you take some pictures along the way. Grab the schematic if you can, if you're not familiar with the reel. And that way, if you do get stuck or you find that one's bigger than the other or whatever, you can come back in and you can make that adjustment and make sure that the right pieces are in the right spots. All right, so it looked like we just had some surface grease there. I'm just kind of mopping that out. There's a little bit of that leaked into the anti-reverse clutch here. So we're just going to clean that out. Now, a lot of people want to oil that anti-reverse clutch. Don't do that. The anti-reverse clutch is a friction-driven series of needle bearings. And if you put oil on it, it causes a slip on the collar, which is this piece here. And a lot of times it'll fail because you'll see here we've got a lot of accumulated grease on this side and on that side. Now it looks like that's kind of been squeezed out of the anti-reverse clutch, so that's a good thing. But just clean that all up. That's not one of the bearings. It's called a bearing. Sometimes you'll see, 4+1 or something like that, the +1 being this. But if you do find that, make sure it's nice and clean. That's the best surface for that. All right, the order on that then is that ferrule, and then there's a little shim washer or tension washer underneath. Then it's our main gear. I'm going to remove that. And then we have two springs that hold your yoke assembly. And we have the yoke assembly. And then we have our jack, which is attached to the back plate. And I'll give you an up front close and personal on that one in case you've taken your reel apart and you're wondering what that looks like. To remove that jack, you simply take the two hooked ends off of the posts here and that jack can come out. In this case, this is just nice and clean, so there's nothing really needs to be done there. I'm just going to give it a little bit of a degreaser there just to pick up any kind of grease or grime that might be in there, but I'm not seeing anything. So we're just going to make sure that gets nice and cleaned, and we'll come back and we'll put oil on that. Again, I don't load grease onto these moving parts because that tends to dry, and if it dries, it bogs down the performance. So we'll just kind of coat that with our reel oil again. This anti-reverse or the free spool release will show you how that's working. It's going to kick in. It's going to push this pin inside, and then we have this little ratchet behind here. That's on the bottom end of your main gear. that's going to come along and it's going to kick it out. I don't have it seated properly, but that's going to kick it out and push everything back up. Of course, everything is out of sorts here, but it's going to kick it back up. Okay, so let's just do the basic lubrication on it. Again, it's very clean. You just want to wipe off any old grease that there is. You want to examine your pinion gear to make sure that all of the teeth are nice and clear, that they're not bent or in any way damaged. That damage can occur when broken line gets in there or another part of the reel internals breaks off. So you just want to check, especially if it's not your reel and you don't know the history behind it. Then you want to get a good coating of grease on there, and we're going to just go ahead and put that back. Now, the yoke is symmetrical, doesn't matter which way it goes, but it does matter on the pinion gear. This goes towards the spool. The short side with the ridges in it goes into the spool. So it works in this way. And you want to put that pinion gear in before you put the main gear back on, just because it seats easier that way. And as those two springs go on top of that, this would be an appropriate time to do that. Okay, now we have that little tooth gear, which is going to kick the point out on that free spool release. Notice that it's not round and it's not rectangular. You have two sides that are rounded and two flat sides. And if you look on your gear shaft here, you're going to find that there's a way that that's going to seat where it's going to be flush. A lot of times I'll get this reel in and somebody will say, I just can't engage my drag washers. And then you go and you find out that the little click ratchet here is not been seated properly, and that's seated properly. You can see that now. You're flush here and you're not rising, it's not rocking. Alright, here's your main gear assembly. We have the hard washer behind, which you don't need to do anything with. Then I'm going to remove these washers. These are HT100 washers and they're in good condition. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to inspect the main gear, make sure that there's no broken teeth or other obstructions in there. Sometimes you find dried grease that's filling the complete tooth, and then you get an uneven reel as you do that. Alright, and then just a liberal dose of grease. You don't need to get it in every tooth. And then we can go ahead and put that back on and mesh that with the pinion gear, which is riding here. Next up then, we've got these HT100 drag washers. I'm going to use Cal's Universal Drag Grease for this. Just going to put a little bit on there, dip it in there, sort of. Then I'm going to use my gloved hand, which is protecting me from greases and oil, as a tool to rub that in. And then you can wipe off the excess if you find that there's much excess on there. You don't want a whole load of grease in that main gear. It's only going to compress and spill out as you service the reel. Alright, clean the metal washers. Now there's two types of metal washers in there. There's the keyed washer, which is the first and third washer, and there's an eared washer because it looks like a face with ears on it that goes in the middle. And after you're done greasing up that second washer, the eared washer goes into the stack, and it also goes into the two holes on each side of the main gear. So make sure that you've seated that properly, and then we'll just finish the last one like we did the other two. We're going to just work it in so that it's got good coverage. Place that back on, and then the last of the keyed washers. So these keyed washers hold the gear shaft, and the eared washer that's set in the slots holds the main gear, and when you compress all of them, they both hold together, and that's what causes the drag and the force that enables you to run the reel. Next up then is that little cap washer or tension washer, and then we have the sleeve for that anti-reverse clutch, and now we're ready just to kind of close it all up. So we just turn it around, kind of eyeballing the center hole for the free spool release, and then just kind of putting it in evenly. And you want to work so that your holes for the screws are properly seated. You usually hear a nice little click, which I heard. I don't know if we were able to pick that up on the video here, but that's how this one's going to load. And we're going to get those two little screws in. And button this reel back up since it really was just in need of some lube and a little bit of cleaning around that anti-reverse clutch there. So if you like these types of videos, I'm going to ask you to subscribe. I do try to post frequently, almost daily. And if you subscribe, hit the notification buttons. That way you'll see when I'm posting. And you'll get to choose which ones you want to watch. I do all kinds of reels. In this case, we're working on a beautiful saltwater 975 Penn International, but all manufacturers' brands, all types of reels, spinning and bait casting and traditional conventional reels and the like. And all right, we seem to be having some technical issues with my camera here. I think my battery's short, but we're at the point now where we're going to tighten down the handle nut. And then we can install our handle nut cap. You need to line your hole with the cap with the hole in the handle. Now we can tighten that up. And then we can reinstall the piece onto our reel, and we'll give it a go. Remember, we've already greased the shaft here. Tighten up the finger screws, and it'll be ready for a test drive. So, all right, give that a whirl. I got a squeaky handle here. I'm just going to use a little bit of WD-40 on that to clear that up. And it looks like that little spinning noise that I had heard is somewhat mitigated. Just a little bit of it, but for the most part, my take on that is that it's just part of the reel's behavior. It's in its DNA. There we go, much less than it was. All right, let's make sure that the free spool happens. It does. We can loosen or adjust with the spool adjuster on the side here, depending on how much play you want in that. And then we should pop this when we turn. And we'll just check one more thing. We've done the drag, so we want to make sure that they're holding. So that's it. That's the Penn International 975. It's a beautiful reel, well made, well manufactured, very popular. And if you have the opportunity to get one of these, it's ideal for inshore ocean. You can do an awful lot with this reel and catch some pretty big fish on it. So I hope you've enjoyed it. This is Dennis with Second Chance Tackle. Thank you for watching.